Hello class, I just wanted to go over Module 5 briefly, determining food and beverage standards. There's not a lot of content in Module 5, but there's important content in Module 5. So this isn't a chapter you can skip over. You'll need to know this very well for your second project, and it's also expected that you understand this very well for the test. So take your time going through this chapter and do not brush over it. The formulas are not especially complicated, but you need to sit back and look at what you're calculating and what, if it makes sense to you, why you'd be doing it. When we look at cost tools, you can follow this on your own, but there's a couple different tools we could use when we have our menu. Remember, everything starts with the menu. We have a cost tool of purchase specification. This tells us exactly what we are purchasing and the quality of what we are purchasing. That would help us determine our usable, edible yield. And then we look at our standard recipe. This would be exactly what is needed and the exact quantity that is needed for our menu item. A cost tool number 3 is standard yield. This is the number of portions or volume. If we're looking at a recipe's standard yield, for example, would be 120 servings, 6-ounce servings. Standard portion size, that's where we get our ounces. If you look down there in the example, if a standard recipe yields 30 pounds of ground beef patties, and if the standard portion size is 8 ounces, then we know the recipe will yield 60 servings, and hopefully that would be spelled correctly. We get this by 30 pounds times 16 ounces in a pound divided by 8-ounce servings. So you'll need to be a little bit familiar with your measurements here to make this work. Standard portion costs. So since the standard recipes in cost 2, that's back here, contain a specific quantity of ingredients. Here it was, standard recipe back here. And we have our standard yield up here and a standard portion size right here. We can do the standard portion cost, and this is really what we're looking for. This is the information at the very end that helps us determine how much we should charge for the item. So in your homework or in the book, you'll see all of these different things mentioned, but this is our goal, to come up with the standard portion cost. In order to come up with the standard portion cost, we will likely have to calculate all of these, or the book will, your problem would have already given it to you. So some of the stuff I'm going to skip over kind of fast because you can read it, and I don't think I need to read it out loud in a PowerPoint. But standard recipes, if you're more of a hospitality major and not in the culinary field as much, I want you to be familiar with the concept of a standard recipe. Think of it as a science experiment. It's a formula for producing an item. It provides consistency, and that's really what you need to come away with. Standard recipes provide consistency. They provide consistency in cost, quality, and portion size. A standard recipe you could find online if you wanted to see some examples. The book provides some examples as well. This would be a situation of 20 pounds of beef, 20 ounces of tomatoes. It's just a recipe like what you see in your recipe books. Figure it out in the quantity needed for mass production. Having standard recipes would help with production planning. It also helps schedule your employees and your equipment. If you have standard recipes, less supervision is needed because the employees know what recipes to follow. Management is less dependent on employees who no-show because anybody else can step in and follow the recipe. When you develop a standard recipe, this could come from something that you created yourself, or maybe a family recipe made for a family of 4. You can decide the yield if you're going to use it in a restaurant. So say I had a recipe that I liked in my home and I wanted to put it on the menu, but my recipe only makes 4 servings. I would be able to convert the recipe to make 20 or 30 servings or 50 servings. That's something that you need to be able to do in this chapter. The idea that if I need 1 cup for 4 servings, how many cups am I going to need for 50 servings? When you develop the standard recipes, you need to list ingredients in the order used. For the non-culinary students, this is an important aspect. You always list the ingredients in the order used. You can determine whether you're using weights or measures or possibly both. You can state quantities in practical amounts. You don't want to necessarily use odd fractions, you know, a whole bunch of teaspoons. You've got to look at those conversion charts to see if you should be starting to use tablespoons, for example. You don't want to have 18 tablespoons. We should probably be using cups at that point. So, you want to make sure they're using practical amounts. You want to be exact. You want to incorporate sanitation concerns. This would include not having ingredients sitting out in unsafe conditions. And this is very important from a cost control perspective. Provide portioning instructions. Remember when we talked earlier about how we had variances. Oftentimes variances come by underserving or overserving portions. Where do we find our recipes? Multi-unit companies have less discretion in the use at local levels. They have, Pitcher McDonald's or Olive Garden. They have standard recipes that every branch serves. But if you have a smaller restaurant, recipes are everywhere. You can find them in books. You can find them in magazines. You can find them, create them yourselves, or you can look online. When you do your project too, I should mention that you do have to come up with recipes, and you might find luck with those online or in a magazine. Standard yields. Yield is how much something produces. So it's the net weight volume of an item after processing and when it's made ready for sale. So in the book, you'll see this abbreviation of AP and EP. AP is as purchased. EP is edible portion. I'd like you to think if you bought hamburger. Say you bought or I guess hamburger isn't a good example. Think of pork chops. You go to the store and you want to make ribs. You can tell I'm a vegetarian. I don't know much about meat. You want to make ribs. So you want the pork off the ribs. So you buy a huge weight. That would be your purchase weight. This whole rack of ribs, I guess. Then you need to cut off all the fat, take out all the bone. People don't eat all that part. So all the meat that comes off, that's your edible portion. Now you have to remember that meat cooks down, so you might have a lot of weight, but the fat cooks out of it. So the weight that you are actually serving is going to be different than the weight that you purchased. So that's what this part of the lecture is all about, is understanding that your purchased weight is going to be different than the amount that's edible. If you even want to think back to carrots, you purchase a carrot, but maybe before you serve the carrot, you've cut off the ends, you've peeled it or whatnot. That is the edible portion. Your purchase portion was the part with the stem on and everything. You can go through apples. You don't eat the core. That part would be removed. That's not going to be the edible portion. This takes place. This is more important when you're dealing with meat because it's a prime ingredient. It's more expensive, and there is going to be a bigger difference between the purchase weight and edible portion weight, especially with concern of cost. So here's an example of oven-prepared beef rib. The edible portion weight was 11 pounds 3 ounces, but the amount that we had actually purchased was 20 pounds 4 ounces, and this is where it went. 3 pounds went to loss due to cooking. 5 pounds went to fat trimming and bones. And so in the end, 20 minus 3.4, all this minus. At the end, we have 11 pounds 3 ounces. This is important because this goes into how much our cost per servable pound is. We can't figure out our cost per servable pound based on the purchase weight because that's not what we're serving. When we go back to thinking about our recipe, we're saying that each person is going to have 8 ounces of servings. That's not 8 ounces based on this weight. It's 8 ounces based on this weight. So take a look here. This is how we determine the percentage of original weight. This should be pretty easy. This is 20 pounds 4 ounces. That's the percentage of original weight. To find out this amount, we would take 3 pounds 4 ounces, divide it into 20 pounds 4 ounces. And that represents 19%. So we lost 19% due to cooking. We lost 25% due to fat trimming and bones. In the end, we have 55% of our original weight was servable. This is important also from a cost control perspective because this is where training comes into play. The trimming of the fat and bones. If you have a skilled employee, this will be done consistently and minimize waste. This could be an area where you find a variance that you need to clean up. Maybe people are trimming away too much, and then you're not going to be meeting your edible portion weight. Remember last class we talked a little bit about ordering quality and making sure our quality was consistent. If you're not getting the right grade of meat, you're going to have a lot more due to loss in cooking. So you might see a variance there. This is the thing a manager would look at too to determine whether a higher grade meat would be better. Maybe we're losing less, and even though we're paying more up front, we might be losing less. Do you remember in the second chapter, I believe, we talked about prepackaged foods, prepared foods. Sometimes you could buy individual servings that would already be trimmed, and then that would help maintain consistency in this aspect. So this problem wants you to figure out the cost per servable pound and cost factor, which we did. And this is a yield test, so that is one way we kind of determine consistency and allow ourselves to figure out what variances would be appropriate, because we actually did test this. We bought 20 pounds, 4 ounces, and we figured out how much was edible in the end. I think I'm going to stop this PowerPoint here so you don't have to listen to super long PowerPoints, and I will pick up here at cost per servable pound.